The recycled air tasted of plastic and faint perfume. Nia adjusted the sleeve of her red silk dress, the fabric a deliberate choice, a splash of confidence for the medical conference she was leaving behind. She was 22, a trauma nurse in her residency, and the dress was her armor. It made her feel older, more formidable than the girl who still sometimes got lost in the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital. She glanced out the window of seat 8B at the endless, impossible blue of the sky over the Pacific. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos she thrived in. The man in 8A had been asleep since before takeoff. He hadn't said a word, just settled into his seat with an unnerving stillness, his presence a weighted silence in the otherwise unremarkable business class cabin. His suit was the first thing she'd noticed. It wasn't just expensive, it was architectural, a shade of charcoal gray so deep it seemed to absorb the light. Tom Ford, she guessed. The cut was precise, severe, outlining a lean, powerful frame. His hands rested on his lap, one over the other. They were elegant, long-fingered, but the knuckles were slightly scarred, and the cuff of his pristine white shirt had slipped just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo. Not a blur of ink, but the distinct, intricate scales of a dragon, rendered in shades of black and deep indigo. At his collar, just above the knot of his silk tie, the creature's horn curled menacingly toward his jawline. He smelled of sandalwood and something else, something cold and clean like ozone before a storm. Nia had told herself it was none of her business. He was just another wealthy passenger. She returned her attention to the medical journal in her lap, trying to focus on an article about new techniques in aortic dissection repair, but her mind kept drifting back to the man beside her. There was an aura of absolute control about him, even in sleep. It was the kind of stillness she saw in veteran surgeons before a life-or-death operation, or in the moments before a patient's body finally gave up the fight. It was the stillness of power. The plane gave a sudden, sickening lurch, dropping a few hundred feet in an instant. A collective gasp filled the cabin. Drinks sloshed. Nia's stomach jumped into her throat, her hand instinctively gripping the armrest. The seatbelt sign chimed on with a frantic insistence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, strained and breathless. Folks, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain in your seats. His voice cut out, replaced by a harsh, staticky pop. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, their smiles tight and unconvincing. Another jolt, more violent this time, rattled the fuselage. The lights flickered, died, then came back on at half strength. A low hum of fear began to circulate, a palpable current of anxiety. Nia's training kicked in, pushing her own fear down. She scanned the cabin, assessing. Panic was a contagion. The key was to keep it contained. Then a new voice came over the speaker, a flight attendant, her tone high and thin. Is there a doctor or a nurse on board? We need immediate assistance at the front of the aircraft. Without a second thought, Nia unbuckled her belt. This was her world. This was what she did. As she stood, the man in 8A stirred. His eyes opened. They were not the groggy, unfocused eyes of someone waking up. They were sharp, dark, and utterly awake, as if he had been listening to the world through his eyelids. He watched her stand, his gaze sweeping over her red dress with an unreadable, analytical intensity. She moved toward the front, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. A flight attendant intercepted her. "Are you a nurse?" she asked, her eyes wide with panic.
Yes.
"Trauma residency," Nia said, her voice calm and even. "What's happening?" "It's the captain. He just collapsed. We think it's his heart. The co-pilot is with him." Nia pushed past her into the galley. The co-pilot was performing clumsy chest compressions on the captain, who was sprawled on the small floor, his face a terrifying shade of gray. His compressions were too shallow, too fast. "Let me," Nia commanded, kneeling down. "I need the defibrillator."
Now.
She worked for what felt like an eternity, her world shrinking to the rhythm of compressions, the charge of the paddles, the desperate fight for a life. The co-pilot, a young man with sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, was trying to fly the plane and help at the same time, his attention fractured. The plane bucked again, and the captain's body slid sickeningly across the floor. They got him back into position, but Nia knew. She'd seen this look 100 times. It was over. The co-pilot stared at her, his face ashen. I can't, he stammered, looking from the captain to the cockpit door. I'm not rated for this aircraft alone. Not in this weather. He was the senior pilot. And then, as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, the co-pilot's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor, his body convulsing. A seizure. Nia reacted instantly, rolling him onto his side, protecting his head from the hard edges of the galley carts. The lead flight attendant looked at Nia, her face a mask of pure terror. "What do we do?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. The plane dipped into a steep, uncontrolled bank. Screams erupted from the cabin. This was it. This was how it ended. The flight attendant grabbed the intercom, her voice trembling so hard the words were nearly unintelligible. Is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane? Please. Anyone. A profound, hopeless silence answered her. The aircraft groaned, the metal frame straining under the pressure. Nia closed her eyes, a strange sense of resignation washing over her. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. It was low, calm, and carried an unmistakable weight of command. I can. Nia's eyes snapped open. The man from 8A was standing at the entrance to the galley. His suit was still impeccable. Not a single strand of his dark hair was out of place. He moved with a liquid grace that seemed to defy the violent motion of the plane, his feet planted, as if he were welded to the floor. His dark eyes found hers, and for a moment, the screaming cabin, the dying plane, it all faded away. There was only the unnerving certainty in his gaze. He stepped over the unconscious co-pilot without a flicker of emotion and moved toward the cockpit. Before he pushed the door open, he stopped and looked back, not at the flight attendant, but directly at Nia. You, he said.
The word was not a request.
It was a summons. With me, that was the moment everything changed. The floor of her world didn't just drop, it disintegrated. She followed him into the cockpit, stepping into a storm of flashing red lights and blaring alarms. The yoke was moving on its own, the autopilot trying and failing to correct their deadly descent. The man, Kaito, she'd heard the flight attendant whisper his name, Mr. Tanaka, slid into the pilot seat. His hands moved over the console with a familiarity that was both terrifying and reassuring. He disabled the alarm with a single, decisive flick of a switch, and the sudden silence was more deafening than the noise. Get him out of the way, Kaito ordered, nodding at the co-pilot seat, which was thankfully empty. Nia helped a male flight attendant drag the still unconscious man out of the cockpit and into the galley. When she returned, Kaito was already fighting the plane, his jaw set, his knuckles white on the yoke. The aircraft shuddered, but the steep bank was slowly, painstakingly, leveling out. The cockpit was impossibly small. To stay out of his way, she had to press herself into the corner behind the co-pilot's seat. She was close enough to feel the tension radiating from him in waves. Close enough to see the dragon tattoo coiling up the strong column of his neck, its eye a malevolent sliver of dark ink. The scent of sandalwood and ozone was stronger here, a strange anchor in the chaos. There's a checklist, he said, his voice a low growl of concentration, never taking his eyes off the instruments. In the side pocket of that seat. Find the one for dual engine failure. Dual engine failure. The words hit her like a physical blow. She fumbled for the binder, her fingers clumsy. She was a nurse. She knew the rhythms of the human body, the protocols for bringing it back from the brink. This metal beast, this complex web of wires and hydraulics, was an alien language. But a checklist was a checklist. A protocol was a protocol. She found the right page, the plastic cool against her trembling hands. Ready, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Read it. Slowly. Clearly. She began to read, her voice a lifeline in the tense silence of the cockpit. Condition: Loss of thrust from both engines. Confirmed, he bit out. Engine start switches. She read the steps, her eyes tracing the words while her mind raced. He responded to each one with a clipped confirmation, his hands moving with surgical precision across the glowing board. He was trying to restart the engines. One by one, he followed the procedures. And one by one, they failed. The silence from the engines was absolute, a dead weight pulling them from the sky. "It's not working," she stated, the obvious hanging heavy between them. "I am aware," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "The fuel lines may have been compromised. Compromised. Not failed. Not broken." The word choice was deliberate. It implied intent. A rehook moment seized her. This was not an accident. "How do you know how to do this?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. He was silent for a long moment, his focus on maintaining their long, slow glide. The plane was a giant, impossibly heavy glider, and he was using what little altitude they had left to buy them time. "I learned," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "For someone I couldn't save," he glanced for a fraction of a second at the empty co-pilot seat, and she saw it then. A flicker of something deep and old in his eyes. It wasn't just grief. It was shame. A profound, corrosive shame that he carried like a second skin. It was the wound he never showed, the one vulnerability in his fortress of control. He had failed to protect a woman. She knew it with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. A woman who was taken from him because of who he was. And now, in this cockpit, he was being forced to face that failure again, with 200 lives in his hands. A flight attendant appeared at the door. "We've made contact with air traffic control. They want to know the pilot's qualifications." Kaito didn't look at her. "Tell them the pilot is qualified. Tell them to clear a runway at the nearest major airport. We have no engine power and will be attempting an unpowered landing." The flight attendant paled. "Shouldn't I stay here? Help you?" she asked, looking at Nia. "Go," Kaito commanded. "Prepare the cabin for emergency landing." Now, the woman fled. He then turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Nia's in the reflection of the dark windshield. "You can go, too. It will be safer in the cabin." It was a test. An out. A chance to run from the man with the dragon tattoo and the ghosts in his eyes. A chance to be just another passenger bracing for impact. But she looked at his hands on the yoke, the immense burden he was carrying alone. She saw the flicker of shame he tried so hard to hide. And she made a choice. "You need a co-pilot," she said. "Someone to read the charts. Tell me what to do." He held her gaze in the reflection for a beat longer. A silent transaction passed between them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was it. She was staying. The danger escalated with a terrifying speed. A new alarm began to shriek, this one higher-pitched, more insistent. A fire warning for the cargo hold. "Sabotage," he muttered, so low she almost didn't hear it. He worked the controls to deploy the fire suppression system. The plane lurched violently as it engaged, throwing Nia forward. She slammed against the back of his seat, her hands flying out to brace herself on his shoulders. His body was rigid beneath her touch, a wall of disciplined muscle. Through the fine wool of his suit, she could feel the coiled power. He didn't flinch. The plane stabilized, but she didn't move. Her hands were still on his shoulders, his scent filling her senses. The proximity was suffocating, electric. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, they were frozen, connected by that desperate point of contact. "Stay still," he breathed, his voice a low vibration that traveled from his shoulders, through her hands, and straight into her bones. His eyes met hers again in the dark glass, and this time, there was something else there. Not just concentration. Not just shame. Something new. Something that recognized her choice to stay, that saw her in a way no one else had. He broke the contact first, his attention returning to the sky. "The landing checklist," he ordered, his voice rougher than before.
"Now."
She retreated, her hands tingling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself it was adrenaline. It was survival instinct. She was lying. Air traffic control was a frantic voice in their ears. relaying weather conditions, runway options, emergency protocols. Kaido was a rock of calm in the storm, his responses clipped and precise. He was making calculations she couldn't begin to comprehend, his mind a tactical map of angles, wind speed, and dwindling altitude. While he was communicating, he tasked her with finding a navigational chart for the approach to the airport. It was supposed to be in the co-pilot's flight bag, a heavy leather case wedged beside the seat. Nia pulled it out and unzipped the main compartment. It was filled with manuals and logbooks. As she dug through them, her fingers brushed against a false bottom, a hard edge beneath the fabric lining. Her training as a trauma nurse had taught her to notice things that were out of place, a subtle change in skin color, a slight tremor in a patient's hand. This was out of place. Her curiosity, a dangerous and persistent trait, took over. She worked her fingers under the lining and pulled. It came away with the sound of tearing Velcro, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were two items. A silenced pistol, its metal finish a dull, non-reflective black, and a small, sophisticated-looking electronic device with a single blinking red light. A listening device, or maybe a detonator. The blood drained from her face. The captain's heart attack, the co-pilot's seizure, the engine failure. The fire. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the mechanical failure. It was a targeted, systematic attack. An assassination attempt happening at 30,000 feet. And the target was the man sitting 3 feet away from her. Kaido Tanaka. They were all just collateral damage in his war. This was the moment she should have screamed. The moment she should have run. The knowledge was a poison, seeping into her, telling her to get away from this man and the violence that clung to him like cologne. But then, she heard a low groan from the galley. She peered through the cockpit door. The co-pilot, the assassin, was stirring. He was pushing himself up, his eyes glassy but focused. He was reaching inside his jacket, reaching for a weapon he no longer had. But Kaido didn't know that. Kaido was in the middle of a critical turn, banking the plane for its final approach, his entire being focused on the task of not letting them all die. He was completely exposed. There was no time to think, no time to warn him. There was only instinct. Nia saw the small, heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the cockpit wall. Her mind, the part that had sworn an oath to do no harm, screamed in protest. But the other part of her, the part that had seen the finality of death too many times, the part that had just chosen to stay, acted. She grabbed the extinguisher, its weight solid and real in her hands. She moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed, out of the cockpit and into the galley. The assassin was on his knees, his hands still fumbling inside his jacket. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her. She didn't hesitate. She swung. The metal canister connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He crumpled instantly, a puppet with its strings cut, and lay still. Silence. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. She stood over the unconscious man, the fire extinguisher clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. A line had been crossed. The red dress suddenly felt like a lie, a costume for a person she no longer was. She was a nurse. She saved lives. But she had just done this. She had chosen a side. She backed into the cockpit, her eyes wide. Kaido had completed the turn. He glanced back, taking in the scene in an instant. Her with the extinguisher, the unconscious man on the floor. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, those ancient, dark eyes, saw everything. They saw her shock, her fear, and the terrible, irrevocable choice she had just made. He didn't condemn her. He didn't praise her. He simply acknowledged the truth of his world, a world she had just forcibly entered. "You see now," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of all emotion except a chilling certainty. "The world is not what they tell you it is." "I'm a nurse," she whispered, the words a desperate prayer to the woman she had been an hour ago. "I save lives." The plane was gliding smoothly now, the runway lights of the airport a distant, glittering promise. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, She saw the man beneath the cold control. "Tonight," he said, and his voice dropped, becoming an intimate, dangerous thing. "You saved mine. That creates a debt." It wasn't a confession of affection. It was a statement of fact in his world. A binding contract written in violence. A claim. It was more terrifying and more honest than any declaration of love could ever be. The finality of his words sealed her fate more surely than the cockpit door. The runway was rushing up to meet them. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. "Call out the altitude," Kaido commanded, his voice pulling her back to the present. "Every 100 feet. Do not stop." She moved to the co-pilot's window, her body thrumming with a strange, focused energy. The fear was still there, but it was a tool now, sharpening her senses. She was no longer a passenger.
She was part of this.
500 feet, she called out, her voice clear and strong. The ground was a blur of motion. 400, she could see the emergency vehicles, lights flashing, racing alongside the runway. 300, the plane felt like it was falling too fast. "Brace," Kaido grunted, his hands sure on the yoke. 200. She saw the crosswind before he did, a sudden gust kicking up dust at the edge of the tarmac. It was going to push them sideways, clip a wing, send them cartwheeling into a fireball. "Crosswind. To your right," she yelled. He corrected instantly, a masterful, fluid motion. He had been blind on that side, relying on her. He had trusted her. 100. The landing was not a landing. It was a controlled crash. The rear wheels slammed into the tarmac with a deafening bang that shot up Nia's spine. The nose came down hard, and the front landing gear collapsed with a scream of tortured metal. The plane skidded, slewing sideways, one wing scraping the ground, sending a shower of orange sparks into the night. Nia was thrown against her seatbelt, the force stealing her breath. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, and then, with a final, shuddering groan, they were still. Silence. A profound, deafening, beautiful silence. It was broken only by their own harsh breathing in the wreckage of the cockpit. Outside, the sirens grew louder, a chorus of rescue. They were alive. Kaido let out a long, slow breath. He leaned his forehead against the yoke for a single second, a momentary surrender to the immense strain. Then he straightened up, all control once more. He had a cut on his forehead, a thin line of blood trickling down his temple, marring his perfect facade. He turned to her. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by an exhausted, raw intensity. He reached out, not to touch her, but his fingers hovered an inch from her cheek, a ghost of a caress. "Nia," he said. He said her name, and it sounded different from anyone else who had ever spoken it. It sounded like an oath, like a possession. "They will ask you questions. The authorities. You saw nothing. You helped a sick co-pilot who passed out from stress. You know nothing about me. Do you understand?" It was an order born of necessity, but it was also for her. To protect her from the world he inhabited, the world that had tried to kill him in the sky. He was acknowledging what she had become to him, a witness he had to control, a debt he had to honor, a person he had to protect. She could only nod, her throat tight. The heavy thud of rescue crews on the fuselage echoed around them. Light flooded the cockpit as they began to pry the door open. This was the end of their strange, suspended reality. The real world was breaking in. Before they were separated, before they became a hero pilot and a brave nurse to the media, he said one last thing. His voice was a low promise, a thread that would tie her to him forever. "This is not over." Nia looked at his hand, the one that had so expertly guided them from death. The dragon tattoo was stark against his skin, and a single drop of his blood had fallen onto one perfect, dark scale, like a ruby. She looked at that drop of blood, and she knew with absolute certainty that he was right. The life she had known, the one with the red dress and the medical conferences, had ended the moment he opened his eyes. A new one, a dangerous and inevitable one, was just beginning.